Welcome on board, Chosen One. Let's Stop Acting Like This began today. It didn't. It started the moment they looked at you and asked, "Who do you think you are?" It started when they dismissed your potential, underestimated your value, told you to stay in your place, wait your turn, and keep your voice down. They told you that you were seeing things that weren't there. They told you nobody was paying attention. They made you question your own instincts. But something changed when the results finally appeared. Suddenly, the laughter disappeared. The jokes became whispers. The same people who once ignored you are now paying close attention to every move you make. Not because you demanded recognition, but because your silence became more powerful than everything they said about you. You never had to chase relevance. You became impossible to overlook. And this is the part they never expected. When someone goes through pressure, isolation, rejection, and uncertainty without allowing those experiences to destroy them, people begin to wonder what makes them different. They start analyzing your behavior, remembering your words, studying your decisions, and trying to understand how you remained composed while they expected you to fall apart. They said, "Eventually they'll bow." You didn't. They said, "Life will humble them." It didn't. They said, "Just wait, they'll break." You didn't. And now the people who once judged you are suddenly looking for a conversation. But understand what this really means. This may not be admiration. It may be an attempt to regain control after realizing they miscalculated you. They've been paying attention because your reality stopped matching the story they created about you. You didn't destroy yourself. You didn't lose control. You didn't spend your life explaining every misunderstanding. You kept learning, adjusting, improving, and moving forward while they remained trapped in the same opinions they formed about you long ago. There is a strange silence that follows a realization like this. You can sense it before anyone says anything. Conversations suddenly become shorter when you arrive. Expressions change. Certain smiles feel different. Compliments sound rehearsed. The atmosphere shifts because the balance of power has already changed. You are no longer standing in the middle of the battle, trying to prove yourself. You are standing after the battle, looking at what remains. Right here, press the like button and subscribe. Let this message remind you that your growth does not need permission from anyone who once underestimated you. Now, back to the message. They weren't watching because you were loud. They were watching because you were controlled, while other people were desperate to be noticed. You were quietly building something that could not be ignored. You stopped explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. You allowed your results to speak, while your silence removed their ability to manipulate the narrative. That kind of discipline makes certain people uncomfortable because your progress reminds them of what they abandoned in themselves. When they look at your journey, they may see the moment they gave up, the shortcut they took, the opportunity they ignored, or the excuse they kept repeating. Your success isn't necessarily what bothers them most. Your consistency is. Your ability to keep going when nobody was cheering is what makes your transformation difficult for them to dismiss. Think about the older version of yourself, the one who was overlooked, laughed at, underestimated, and repeatedly told to be realistic. That version of you endured things quietly and still kept moving. While others were announcing what they planned to accomplish, you were developing the skills to actually do it. While others were searching for validation, you were building confidence through experience. That is not simply luck, that is preparation. Life responds to patterns more than promises. And your pattern changed. Now the same people who once kept their distance may suddenly want access. They want to sit closer to the table they once told you that you would never reach. They want answers to questions they previously mocked. They want to understand how you changed without announcing the process. And that is the uncomfortable truth. They are late. Meetings like this rarely happen when people still feel superior. They happen when someone realizes they may have fallen behind. This is where the person they once labeled the problem becomes the person they can no longer ignore. Not because you apologized for becoming stronger, not because you made yourself smaller, not because you softened your standards. You simply continued becoming who you were supposed to become. You walk into that room calm, observant, and completely unhurried. You are not there to prove your worth. You are not there to convince anyone of your value. You don't need to explain the scoreboard when the results are already visible. You don't announce your power, you carry it quietly. They thought observing you would give them control over you. Instead, their attention revealed how much they needed to understand you. The critics became curious. The people who judged you became cautious. The ones who dismissed you became quiet. That is what happens when you outgrow the version of yourself that other people were comfortable controlling. This is not just a hype speech. It is a reminder. You may have questioned yourself during those difficult seasons, but you kept moving. You may have felt the atmosphere changing before you had the words to explain it, but you trusted yourself enough to pay attention. And now the same people who once dismissed your awareness are noticing the transformation they never expected. Now pause here for a moment, because this is where the real story begins. Not in the flashy moments, not in the applause. The real shift happened during the quiet seasons when nobody was watching. If you sensed the distance, noticed the change in behavior, or felt people studying you from a distance, understand that your greatest evidence was never their reaction. It was the fact that you continued growing anyway. They didn't simply observe your success. They studied your endurance. They watched how you handled being alone. They noticed how you moved when there was no audience, no applause, and no validation. That is why this next part matters. We are not here to create fear. We are here to understand the psychology of being underestimated and the power of remaining composed when other people expect you to react. So if this message feels familiar, stay with it. Hit the like button and subscribe if you want more messages like this. And if you're ready to understand why their curiosity eventually turned into a conversation, drop 777 in the comments, not because the number has magical power, but because it represents your decision to stay focused and finish what you started. Now we move carefully, step by step. No unnecessary noise, no desperate explanations, just clarity. And if this message is truly meant for you, you'll understand why staying until the end matters. Number 1, the moment they realized you were not imagining everything. They didn't start paying attention because you were weak. They started because you refused to collapse. It didn't begin with some dramatic confrontation. It began through patterns. The same people appearing too often. Similar questions being asked in different ways. Strange pauses when you entered a room. Small changes in behavior that were easy to dismiss individually but impossible to ignore when they kept repeating, "Months ago, something shifted," and you sensed it before you could explain it. That wasn't necessarily fear, it was awareness. The kind of awareness that makes you slow down, observe more carefully, and stop ignoring your instincts. You noticed patterns because you had learned that repeated behavior often reveals more than words ever will. They may have expected uncertainty to silence you. Instead, it made you more observant. They wanted you questioning yourself. They wanted you saying, "Maybe I'm overthinking this." But instead of reacting emotionally, you became more careful about what you shared, who you trusted, and what you revealed. That was the first thing they didn't expect. You didn't announce your suspicions. You didn't create unnecessary drama. You simply paid attention. And when you pay attention without reacting, people often reveal far more than they intended. A person who is overly curious may ask questions that don't fit the relationship. Someone may suddenly appear where there is no real reason to be there. Someone may remember details you never directly shared with them. Small things begin adding up. They thought you weren't noticing. They were wrong. And here is where the situation becomes uncomfortable for anyone who expected an emotional reaction from you. You didn't panic. You didn't confront everyone. You didn't lose yourself trying to figure out every detail. You adjusted. You shared less. You listened more. You allowed people to speak. You gave yourself enough distance to recognize patterns instead of reacting to isolated moments. You didn't become paranoid, you became intentional. And intentional people are difficult to manipulate because they don't give everyone immediate access to their emotions, they said. It's nothing, they said. You're thinking too much. They said, relax. Nobody is paying that much attention. Yet somehow those same people kept noticing your movements, asking questions, comparing information, and trying to understand what had changed about you. So why you? Because you stopped behaving like someone who needed approval. You stopped chasing attention. You stopped explaining every decision. And instead of collapsing under pressure, you became quieter, more disciplined, and harder to predict. That is when ordinary curiosity can turn into intense interest. When someone doesn't respond according to the script others expected, it creates uncertainty. You didn't overshare. You didn't perform for the room. You didn't constantly defend yourself. You simply continued moving forward while other people were still trying to understand the person you used to be. That difference created distance between their expectations and your reality. Here is the part nobody wants to admit. People rarely spend enormous energy studying someone they genuinely believe is irrelevant. Attention itself can reveal that something has changed. They weren't necessarily looking for your weaknesses anymore. They were trying to figure out where your strength came from. And the longer they watched without seeing the collapse they expected, the more confusing your transformation became. No dramatic breakdown, no public failure, no desperate attempt to win approval. Just steady progress, controlled reactions, and results appearing one after another. That is the moment curiosity begins to disappear and realization takes its place. They finally understood that the person they underestimated was never as powerless as they assumed. And now they have a choice. Continue believing the old story they created about you, or finally accept that you became someone their old assumptions can no longer explain. You may have asked yourself at some point, if they've been paying attention, why haven't they made a move? Because observers hesitate. People who act have to take risks, and they couldn't figure out where you stood. They couldn't predict your next decision. You weren't announcing your intentions. You weren't revealing your strategy. You simply continued living without feeling the need to explain yourself. And whether you realized it or not, that became one of your greatest advantages. Picture a room filled with people talking while one person remains completely silent. Eventually, attention moves toward that silence. Not because there is nothing there, but because everyone starts wondering what is beneath it. That was you, the unanswered question, the unpredictable factor. The person who refused to constantly prove what they were doing. They thought time would eventually expose your weaknesses. Instead, time strengthened your position. And then something changed. Watching became curiosity. Curiosity became a desire for access. Observation turned into an invitation. The meeting request may look like cooperation on the surface, but underneath it is often about understanding what they could not figure out from a distance. They want to know whether your calm is genuine, whether your confidence has substance, and whether the strength they observed from afar remains when they are sitting directly across from you. Here is the part they never intended to give you. You already passed the first test without realizing there was a test. You survived the period when everyone was watching for you to make a mistake. You didn't destroy your own progress. You didn't become desperate under pressure. You didn't hand people unnecessary ammunition. Instead, you became harder to disturb. And if you've been wondering whether all of this is simply coincidence, understand the bigger lesson. Consistency eventually becomes visible. Pressure was applied, but you remained stable. Challenges appeared, but you continued moving. That is what makes the old narrative harder to maintain. The insults stop working, the labels lose their power, the rumors stop carrying the same weight. You grew beyond the version of you they were still trying to define. While they were holding on to an outdated story, you were becoming someone that story could no longer contain. This isn't about ego, it's about awareness. You weren't necessarily being attacked every second. You were being evaluated, judged, measured, and underestimated. And somehow you passed the test simply by remaining yourself. That explains why the attention lasted. They were looking for weakness and kept finding discipline. They were expecting instability and kept seeing composure. Eventually, distance stopped giving them the comfort it once did, and that is when they wanted direct access. Number 2, you turned their attention back on themselves. They believed they were collecting information about you. What they failed to recognize was that every attempt to study you was revealing something about them. This is where the story stops being about intimidation and becomes a lesson in self-control. When most people feel pressure, they immediately react. They explain too much. They overshare. They rush to defend themselves. They try to repair an image before anyone has even accused them of anything. You didn't. You remained steady. You adjusted when necessary, but you never allowed pressure to dictate your behavior. They expected a reaction, but you gave them patience. They expected you to disappear, but you continued forward. They expected emotional chaos, but you remained composed. And that difference completely changed the dynamic. You never had to confront every person who was watching. You never had to announce that you noticed. You simply refused to behave like someone who was being controlled. The moment you stop acting afraid of observation, the people observing you begin questioning their own position. Imagine someone following another person through a complicated maze, convinced they are discovering the route. But what if the person being followed already understands the environment better than the observer? Realizes every turn becomes information, every reaction becomes a clue. The person doesn't have to run. They can remain calm because they are not lost. That is what patience can do. You didn't need to make dramatic changes. Sometimes you simply changed your availability protected certain information, became more selective with what you shared, or allowed people to reveal how interested they really were. You stopped giving everyone the same level of access, and suddenly people who depended on knowing everything about you had less information to work with. This wasn't about becoming deceptive, it was about becoming selective. People who watch from a distance often create their own explanations when they don't have the full picture. They fill empty spaces with assumptions. They turn ordinary actions into theories. They assign meanings to your silence that may not even exist. And in doing so, they reveal more about their own expectations than they reveal about you. You may have wondered, am I playing some kind of game? No, you were learning to observe before reacting. You were noticing who became unusually curious when you changed direction. You were noticing who suddenly needed information they had never earned access to. You were learning who respected boundaries and who became uncomfortable when those boundaries appeared. You weren't hiding yourself, you were filtering access. And one of the clearest truths about people is revealed by their reactions to things that never actually happened. Someone may interpret your silence as a secret. Someone else may interpret your calm as confidence. Another person may assume you are planning something simply because they cannot predict you. But the real thing they failed to understand was much simpler. You had stopped giving them the ability to define your next move. Think about two people sitting across from a chessboard. One is focused on the last move. The other is thinking several possibilities ahead. The difference isn't necessarily intelligence. It is awareness. One person reacts to individual moments, while the other pays attention to the pattern developing. Over time, that was the difference. They focused on isolated details. You started noticing behavior. They remembered individual moments. You remembered patterns. They followed noise. You watched consistency. And eventually their own assumptions began contradicting each other. One person expected one thing from you, while another expected something completely different. Their certainty began turning into confusion. And confusion becomes a serious weakness when someone is trying to maintain control. You didn't need authority to create that shift. You didn't need status. You didn't need a position of power. You needed patience. Patience has a way of exposing people who depend on urgency. While they rushed to conclusions, you slowed down. While they tried to interpret every moment, you watched the bigger picture. While they reacted to what they thought you were doing, you focused on what was actually happening. Eventually, people who think they understand you begin revealing how little they actually know. Their theories become inconsistent, their reactions become exaggerated, their assumptions begin driving their behavior. And sometimes the more they try to predict you, the more they reveal themselves. You may have asked yourself, what if I'm completely wrong about all of this? That question is normal. It is healthy to question your assumptions and remain grounded in reality. But the deeper lesson is not about proving that everyone is watching you. It is about recognizing what you learned about yourself during seasons of uncertainty. You discovered that you could sit with unanswered questions without falling apart. You could be misunderstood without desperately correcting everyone. You could experience pressure without abandoning your character. You could protect your peace without needing everyone to understand your reasons. That is real maturity. Anyone who needs immediate approval from everyone around them will struggle to remain steady when opinions change. But when you become secure within yourself, outside reactions lose their ability to control your direction. And that is what makes restraint so powerful. You didn't change the situation through aggression. You changed your position through discipline. You didn't need to become louder. You became more internally certain. And internal clarity rarely announces itself. You simply start moving differently. Now step back and look at the irony. They believed they were gathering information about you. Instead, their own behavior kept revealing information about them. Every unnecessary question, every sudden interest, every unusual reaction. Every attempt to understand what you were doing gave you another opportunity to observe who they were becoming around you. The people who thought they were studying you may have accidentally shown you exactly how they think. And that is the moment you realize the greatest advantage was never knowing every move they might make. It was becoming so grounded in yourself that you no longer needed to fear whatever move came next. Watching eventually became exposure. By the time they understood what was happening, the dynamic had already changed. You were no longer simply the person being observed. You had become the unpredictable factor they couldn't easily understand or influence. That is why the meeting came later, after all the watching. Once someone realizes the person they were studying was also paying attention, distance no longer feels as comfortable. Suddenly, they want proximity. They want direct conversation. They want to look you in the eyes and discover whether the calm they saw from a distance is just an act or the result of real inner strength. Here is the truth of this entire phase. You didn't overcome them by being more clever. You simply remained steady longer than they expected. You didn't need to dominate anyone. You needed endurance. And endurance has a way of defeating pressure that depends on quick reactions. They were focused on observation. You were focused on time. They were trying to predict the next moment. You were willing to let the moments pass. Sometimes the strongest checkmate is not a move at all. It is refusing to rush. Number 3, the day fear stopped controlling your decisions. The moment fear stopped getting a reaction from you, something changed. After several months, the attention became more obvious. The subtle looks became easier to notice. The unnecessary questions became more frequent. The distance seemed smaller, and eventually you realized they were no longer simply trying to understand what you were doing. They wanted to see whether they could make you uncomfortable. This was no longer about observation. It was about reaction. They wanted you to feel the pressure. They wanted you to notice the eyes, the atmosphere, the tension. They expected you to become cautious in a way that erased your personality. That is what often happens when people believe they are being watched. They become smaller. They censor themselves. They stop taking risks. They try to become invisible. But you did something different. You became more grounded in who you were. You didn't pretend to be fearless. You simply stopped allowing other people's attention to dictate your behavior. You became more relaxed, more direct, and more comfortable with being seen. You didn't need to perform innocence or manufacture confidence. You simply moved like someone who had already accepted that not everyone would understand them. Imagine someone shining a bright light into a room, expecting the person inside to panic, only to discover that the person calmly looks back. At that moment, the light loses its ability to intimidate. It stops being a weapon and becomes a reflection. That is what happened when their attention stopped frightening you. Their gaze became less powerful because you stopped treating it as a threat. Fear only controls you when you believe someone else has the authority to decide how you should exist Once you stop giving them that authority, their pressure loses its grip. They begin asking questions they never expected to ask. Why aren't they nervous? Why aren't they hiding? Why do they seem even more confident now? The harder they watched, the more composed you became. That composure revealed something deeper. Self-ownership. You weren't trying to provoke anyone. You weren't looking for conflict. You simply refused to let invisible pressure manage your choices. You didn't overreact. You didn't become reckless. You stayed aligned with yourself. And that is when people who depend on controlling reactions begin losing their advantage. Think about fire. Too much force can make it spread, but when it burns steadily, it becomes focused and difficult to disturb. Their attention didn't destroy your confidence. It refined it. It removed hesitation. It forced you to decide who you were without constantly asking whether other people approved. Nothing makes control weaker than a person who no longer begs to be accepted. That is when they realized their attention had produced the opposite result. They expected you to shrink. Instead, you became sharper. They expected pressure to weaken you. Instead, it made you more certain. The problem was no longer what you might eventually do. The problem was who you had already become. Number 4, when you stopped resisting being seen. They thought they were studying your behavior. What they didn't realize was that their attention was no longer controlling your behavior. This is where observation became almost embarrassing for the people doing it. They expected nervousness, guarded answers, tense body language, and someone constantly checking who was watching. Instead, they saw someone comfortable in their own presence. You didn't disappear when the attention became heavier. You became even more natural. You didn't aggressively challenge anyone. You simply stopped acting like you needed to escape the spotlight. You moved with calmness, spoke clearly, and allowed yourself to exist without constantly adjusting for other people's expectations. That changed the entire dynamic. They assumed distance gave them an advantage, but you no longer needed to create distance just to feel safe. You understood that visibility can become powerful when you choose it instead of having it forced upon you. Imagine someone believing they are secretly observing you through a one-way mirror, only to realize that the entire time the person on the other side was aware of their presence. There is no panic in that moment. There is only realization. The observer suddenly understands that the person they thought was unaware may have noticed far more than they expected. The spotlight only becomes intimidating when you are uncertain about yourself. When you know who you are, attention becomes just attention. You don't have to hide. You don't have to perform. You don't have to explain every move. You can simply remain consistent. That is what they saw. You spoke with confidence. You laughed naturally. You carried yourself without constantly checking for approval. You weren't trying to impress anyone, and you weren't trying to prove that you were unaffected. You simply were unaffected enough to remain yourself, and slowly their certainty began to weaken. The questions became softer. Their assumptions became less confident. Their behavior changed because the response they expected never appeared. What they could not easily admit was simple. You were no longer cooperating with the version of you they had created in their minds. Think of a stage. They believed they were controlling what happened behind the curtain. While you eventually stepped into the light and realized you didn't need to follow their script, suddenly they were no longer directing the scene, they were watching it unfold. When observation stops changing someone's behavior, it loses much of its power. You weren't trying to perform for them. You were simply demonstrating that their attention no longer controlled your identity. That is when watching becomes useless. They expected to see you unravel. Instead, they saw you become more composed. Number 5. The meeting is not necessarily an invitation. It is an admission that you can no longer be ignored. They may not be looking for simple answers. They may be trying to understand how you remained so steady. Let's remove the fantasy and look at the deeper lesson. When people spend months observing someone, they often expect a predictable reaction. Pressure increases, confidence drops. Criticism grows, approval seeking begins. Isolation arrives, and the person starts looking for acceptance. But you didn't follow that pattern. You remained consistent. You didn't suddenly become desperate for approval. You didn't change your personality just because you felt attention around you. You didn't become louder to prove strength, and you didn't become smaller to avoid conflict. You remained grounded. That challenged the framework they were using to understand you. Here is the truth. They may never say directly. They don't understand you because you don't respond to the same triggers they expect everyone else to respond to. Fear doesn't automatically control your decisions. Attention doesn't determine your value. Validation doesn't define your identity. And when someone cannot be easily controlled through those things, distance becomes less useful. Imagine a system designed to pressure test people suddenly encountering someone who doesn't respond the way the system predicts. The system doesn't know what to do next. Its usual methods stop producing the expected result. That is the real shift. You exposed a limitation in the way they were trying to understand you. Control works best when a person is desperate for permission, approval, or acceptance. But when you become comfortable standing on your own principles, those tools lose their effectiveness. So the meeting may be less about cooperation than curiosity. They may want to sit across from you and determine whether the composure they noticed from a distance is genuine. They may want to experience your presence directly because observation alone never gave them the certainty they wanted. But here is what they still won't understand. Your strength is not dependent on a position. It is not borrowed from applause. It doesn't disappear when someone challenges you, and it doesn't become greater simply because someone finally notices it. It comes from knowing who you are and remaining anchored in that identity. You don't need the meeting to prove anything. You don't need their approval to validate your progress. You don't need them to finally understand you. If they want a conversation, let them come with clarity and respect. You can listen without surrendering your boundaries. You can speak without defending your entire existence. You can remain calm without pretending to be superior. They are not summoning you because you need them. They are approaching because they finally understand that the person they once underestimated cannot simply be ignored anymore. Number 6. The one thing about you they could never turn into leverage. They searched for something they could use against you, but they kept coming up empty. That is what made them uneasy. Not necessarily angry, not loud, just uncertain. Fear usually needs something to grab onto. It needs a weakness, an insecurity, a secret, or an unresolved wound that can be pulled into the open. They looked for cracks and found clarity. They searched for vulnerabilities and discovered scars that had already healed. You didn't react because you had already faced yourself. You didn't rush to defend every weakness because you had already confronted those weaknesses privately. There was no hidden shame waiting for someone else to expose. No secret story that could suddenly make you feel worthless. When you have already accepted the difficult parts of your past, someone else cannot easily use them to control your future. Imagine trying to intimidate someone with a truth they have already made peace with. The threat loses its power. Imagine trying to frighten someone with a chapter they already survived. The words become empty. That was the problem they encountered with you. The usual pressure points didn't work because you were no longer running from yourself. You cannot easily manipulate someone who has stopped being ashamed of their own history. But what truly unsettled them was your consistency. You weren't confident only when everything was going your way. You weren't calm one day and completely scattered the next. Your stability didn't depend on perfect circumstances. It remained present during pressure, uncertainty, silence, and difficult seasons. That kind of steadiness is difficult to fake because it comes from internal alignment. Picture a powerful storm moving through a landscape. Trees bend, signs shake, branches break, and everything around them responds to the force of the wind. Yet somewhere in the middle stands a structure that remains grounded. It doesn't need to fight the storm. It simply doesn't collapse under it. That was the lesson your behavior demonstrated. There may have been moments when you noticed people paying attention. Instead of allowing that awareness to control you, you continued living your life. You didn't have to challenge every observer. You didn't need to prove that you noticed. You simply remained composed. And sometimes a calm expression says more than a confrontation ever could. It can communicate, "I know what I know, and I'm still at peace." That is what made you difficult to reach. Not because you were invincible, not because nothing ever affected you, but because you stopped handing other people access to the parts of yourself they could use to control you. Number 7. You turned their system into a reflection of itself. Systems rarely collapse because of one dramatic moment. Sometimes they weaken because they begin contradicting their own assumptions. That is where the entire dynamic started changing. The people observing you were supposed to be gathering information about you, but eventually their own reactions began becoming part of the story. Their observations stopped being purely about what you did and started revealing what they believed about what you did. That is when the system began turning inward. You didn't behave like someone under constant pressure. You didn't create unnecessary conflict. You didn't constantly fight against every assumption. You simply continued living your life. And that normal behavior created a problem for anyone expecting extreme reactions. Their framework depended on predictable responses: panic, submission, rebellion, emotional collapse, or desperate attempts to prove innocence. You gave them none of those. Imagine a machine designed to detect a specific signal being connected to someone who produces no such signal. The machine keeps searching, adjusting, and recalculating, but the expected result never appears. The problem isn't necessarily the person being measured. The problem is that the system was built around an assumption that no longer applies. That was the contradiction. You didn't trigger the response they expected. You didn't confirm the story they had already written. You didn't fit neatly into the categories they wanted to place you inside. And eventually every attempt to interpret you started revealing more about the person doing the interpreting. One person might call your confidence arrogance. Another might interpret your silence as defiance. Someone else might assume you were planning something when you were simply focused on your own life. They were no longer simply describing you. They were projecting their expectations onto you. And that is an important lesson. When people cannot understand your behavior, they often explain it through their own fears. You didn't need to attack the system, you simply stopped validating it. A person who doesn't react dramatically, doesn't constantly seek approval, and doesn't need permission to exist can expose how fragile artificial control really is. Think of a measuring scale designed to detect chaos, suddenly being asked to measure balance. The readings become confusing. The operators start questioning the instrument. They argue over the results. The system begins struggling because the thing in front of it doesn't behave the way the system was designed to expect. Your stability became the unexpected variable. They thought they were studying a subject. Eventually, their own reactions became part of what needed to be understood. And once someone recognizes their own fear, assumptions, and projections, it becomes much harder to pretend those things never existed. Number 8. You exposed the limit they never expected to reach. They needed you to fit into a specific explanation. They wanted to measure your behavior, label your personality, and place you neatly into a category that made everything comfortable. But the framework kept failing. Not because you were some impossible mystery, because you were grounded. You didn't need to behave dramatically to remain strong. You didn't need some extraordinary advantage to keep moving. You simply refused to let fear dictate every decision. And that can be more unsettling than chaos. They could explain someone who was unusually talented. They could explain someone who had extraordinary resources. They could explain someone who acted dramatically or rebelled openly. But what happens when an ordinary person simply decides they will not be intimidated? That question is much harder to dismiss. If someone can remain calm without permission, continue forward without constant approval, and refuse to shrink under pressure, then the problem may not be the person. The problem may be the framework being used to control them. Imagine a rule book designed to influence behavior, encountering someone who doesn't need to break the rules but also refuses to surrender their identity to the emotional expectations behind those rules. The book doesn't explode, it simply becomes less useful. Page after page stops explaining what is happening. That was the lesson you represented. They didn't necessarily fear rebellion as much as they feared evidence that their assumptions were wrong. Every observation became another reminder that you were not behaving according to the script they expected. You didn't claim to be powerful. You didn't constantly announce how different you were. You simply continued standing in your own identity. And that created an uncomfortable comparison. If strength can look this calm, then what have they been mistaking for strength all along? Think about a door everyone assumes is securely locked. One person calmly reaches for the handle and discovers that it opens. No force, no dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet realization that the barrier was never as powerful as everyone believed. That is the lesson. They weren't necessarily learning how to control you. They were discovering the limits of their own assumptions. You didn't have to teach this through speeches. Your behavior communicated it. Your patience communicated it. Your refusal to collapse communicated it. And that realization cost them certainty. Number 9. Your freedom is the variable they cannot easily control. They may not fear who you are as much as they fear what your example makes possible. Let's make this clear. Your value doesn't come from being perfect, superior, or magically different from everyone else. Your strength comes from learning how to live according to your own values instead of constantly adjusting yourself to satisfy every outside expectation. That kind of freedom is difficult to control. People can often predict behavior driven by fear. They can understand someone who desperately needs approval. They can anticipate someone who is motivated entirely by status, attention, or validation. But a person who becomes internally secure is much harder to steer. Freedom doesn't constantly ask, "How will everyone react?" Freedom doesn't reshape itself every time someone disapproves. Freedom doesn't wait for permission to become itself. And once you experience that kind of internal freedom, it becomes difficult to return to the old version of yourself. Imagine a bird sitting beside an open window while everyone else is still arguing about the cage. The bird doesn't need to destroy the cage. It doesn't need to fight the people guarding it. It simply understands that the open sky is available. That changes the meaning of the cage. That is what your transformation can represent. You didn't need to attack anyone's authority. You didn't need to break every rule. You simply stopped living as though someone else had to approve every decision you made, and that can make an outdated structure look powerless very quickly. The deeper lesson is not that you are untouchable or that everyone around you is against you. The lesson is that your peace becomes stronger when it is no longer dependent on controlling other people's opinions. You can be observed without becoming obsessed with being observed. You can be misunderstood without losing yourself. You can face pressure without surrendering your identity. And you can walk into any room without needing the room to tell you who you are. That is the freedom they never expected. Not freedom from every challenge. Freedom from needing every challenge to define you. They want the meeting because your freedom confuses them. They want to understand it, reduce it to a formula, and convince themselves that you simply discovered some clever strategy. But the truth is harder to accept. You made a choice they never made. You stopped waiting for permission. Imagine a crowd standing in line for years, then suddenly noticing one person calmly walking outside the line. No rebellion, no shouting, just freedom. Once people see that the line was never absolute, the entire structure begins to look different. You didn't escape dramatically. You simply walked away. And now they want an explanation that will make them feel comfortable again. Number 10, the room where they expected control and found calm. They may prepare talking points, questions and strategies, believing preparation gives them leverage. But this meeting is not really a test for you, it is a reveal for them. They watched you under pressure for months and expected nervousness, defensiveness, or a need to explain yourself. Instead, you walk in steady. You listen without seeking approval. You speak without needing to prove your worth. You ask questions for clarity, not confrontation. They expected resistance or submission, but they encounter someone who doesn't need the room to validate them. They came prepared to manage you. They may leave realizing they never had that power. Number 11. The version of you they studied no longer exists. They may arrive with notes about your old behavior, old fears, and old motivations, but you have already moved beyond them. They were studying snapshots while you were changing. Their questions may belong to a chapter you already finished. Think of an outdated map trying to guide someone through a city that has completely changed. The traveler isn't lost. The map is simply obsolete. You didn't necessarily move faster than them. You simply refused to stop growing while they were trying to understand the old you. Number 12. You didn't lead a revolt. You broke the spell. You never needed to preach, recruit people, or announce a mission. You simply lived without allowing fear to control every decision. And when someone calmly exists inside a system built around fear, other people begin noticing the contradiction. Imagine a room where everyone whispers because they believe speaking normally is forbidden. One person finally speaks at a normal volume and nothing happens. The silence disappears. That is the power of example. You didn't overthrow anything. You revealed that some of the limits were never as powerful as people believed. Number 13. They came to observe and left questioning themselves. At first there was confusion because you didn't react as expected. Then frustration because you didn't bend. Then curiosity because you remained steady. And eventually some may have felt admiration. They never planned for that. Observation was supposed to remain detached, but your calmness forced comparison. Imagine someone guarding a wall for years and suddenly noticing another person living freely on the other side. They may not immediately leave their position, but they begin asking why they are still standing there. You didn't recruit anyone. You simply became an example of what life can look like without constant fear. Number 14. The interrogation that becomes a confession. They may call it a meeting, but the deeper purpose could be understanding what they could not explain from a distance. They expect pressure to make you crack, but pressure only works when someone feels trapped. You don't need to dominate the room, and you don't need to submit to it. You can sit calmly, listen carefully, and answer only what deserves an answer. Their questions may reveal more about their uncertainty than about you. They want to know how you remain steady without the approval they thought you needed. And that brings us to the end of this chapter. You were never required to defeat anyone. You were required to stop allowing fear to define your choices. You didn't need to destroy the system. You simply outgrew the version of yourself that depended on it. What began as observation eventually became curiosity, and curiosity eventually became a meeting because they could no longer understand you from a distance. You don't walk into that room to prove who you are. You walk in already knowing.